2 wars, countless nations, and some 105 million lives lost in total. But why do we talk about World War II so much more than World War I? From an American perspective, it's easy to see why World War II often garners more attention than World War I. The United States was involved for a longer period, distributed more aid, and fought more battles. Though World War I began in August 1914, the U.S. did not enter the war until April 1917, barely 19 months before its conclusion. On the other hand, the U.S. was involved in World War II much earlier and ended up participating for 3.5 years. Economically, the U.S. role in World War I amounted to a hefty $7 billion. However, that pales in comparison to the roughly $50 billion the United States gave out in Lend-Lease supplies during World War II, and that's to say nothing of what it cost to actually fight the war. In addition, the post-war Marshall Plan, enacted in 1948 as the European Recovery Program, provided a massive contribution to the rebuilding of Europe. This policy is also closely linked to World War II.
If it had not been for the Marshall Plan, I don't know what would have happened.
Finally, the U.S. Armed Forces played a much more significant role on the battlefield during World War II. For example, the U.S. was a key player in both the Pacific and Western theaters of operation, and roughly 16 million Americans served in World War II as a whole, versus just 4.7 million in World War I. War is so often fought in shades of gray that it seems odd to refer to anybody involved as the villains. This is true to an extent of World War I. During this war, the leaders of the Central Powers were Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary and his grandnephew Charles I, as well as the Young Turk Triumvirate of the Ottoman Empire, chief among whom was Talat Pasha. While these leaders were anything but perfect, they're remembered quite differently compared to the Axis dictators of World War II. Adolf Hitler is widely considered to be one of history's greatest monsters, and he is widely used as a measuring stick for the concept of evil. Meanwhile, Benito Mussolini is just as notorious for his brutal dictatorship, and the Japanese Emperor Hirohito holds an ugly, if disputed, legacy of conduct during the war. Even the Allies had their own notorious leaders during the war. Joseph Stalin, one of the 21st century's worst dictators, led the Soviet Union. Future People's Republic of China's leader Mao Zedong was also active during the war as a member of the Chinese United Front. Chiang Kai-shek, another Chinese militant during the war, is also infamous for his extremely repressive post-war government in Taiwan. The perpetrators of World War I were no angels, sure, but World War II's popular memory is partly driven by the legacy of history's worst villains. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the most tragic incidents in United States history, and it might be the single biggest reason Americans talk about the Second World War more than the First. The attack commenced in the early hours of December 7, 1941, when the Japanese military launched a surprise bombing against the U.S. Navy's base at Pearl Harbor in Oahu, Hawaii. In all, more than 2,400 Americans lost their lives, including 68 civilians. Several battleships were lost, including the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma, which, combined, accounted for more than 1,400 deaths alone. Every year, the nation holds various remembrances on December 7, and the government designated that date as the National Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day.
The American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
There was no equivalent attack on United States soil during the First World War. The most comparable incident was probably the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed 128 Americans. However, the Lusitania did not spark an immediate declaration of war like Pearl Harbor, and the loss of life was much less. No doubt they were both horrible events, but Pearl Harbor has lasted far longer in the American psyche. By far, one of the most romantic aspects of the Second World War was the role played by fighter pilots. Today, the dogfights and bombing runs that took place over cities and battlefields around the world are counted among the most widely celebrated aspects of the war. Many World War II movies revolve around the air war, from the Tuskegee Airmen to Red Tails to Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg's upcoming series Masters of the Air. Airplanes certainly played a part in World War I, but they were not nearly as important as they would become a few decades later. Many of the aircraft of the First World War were primitive compared to those of the 1940s, and at first, most of them did not even have guns installed on them. The pilots instead relied on handheld weapons to shoot at each other. The machine guns were quickly put in place as aerial technology rapidly improved. There's a lot of drama to be found in the Second World War's airborne combat, too. One of the biggest battles of World War II, the Battle of Britain, was fought largely through the air and won by the skill of the Royal Air Force's pilots. The story of Japan's kamikaze pilots has also attracted much morbid curiosity over the years. Generally speaking, the air war of World War II stands as one of the key reasons people remain fascinated by the conflict to this day. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki heralded a nuclear age that has not yet come to an end. Lower estimates suggest that 120,000 Japanese people died in the bombings themselves, the vast majority of them civilians, and that's not counting those who perished in the years after. Obviously, no atomic weapons were used in World War I because the technology had not been invented yet. The birth of the atomic age is solely connected with World War II, and it's a significant reason why we still so frequently discuss the war today. The atomic bomb has also spawned a great deal of media interest, and the threat of nuclear war has inspired some of Hollywood's greatest blockbusters. Most recently, of course, Christopher Nolan's biopic Oppenheimer told the haunting story of J. Robert Oppenheimer's work during and after the war.
You are the man who gave them the power to destroy themselves, and the world is not prepared.
Naval warfare changed a great deal between World War I and World War II. While the German U-boat submarines of World War II certainly enjoyed a fierce and well-earned reputation, actual naval combat during that conflict was much less prevalent than in World War II. The majority of the fighting during the First World War took place on land, when vast naval battles spanned the North Atlantic, Pacific, and beyond. In terms of major World War I naval confrontations, only the battles of Dogger Bank and Jutland are particularly well remembered today. These were significant battles, but they don't really compare to the massive naval showdowns of World War II, such as Midway, Santa Cruz, and Coral Sea, which amounted to engagements of epic proportions. Much of this had to do with the advent of the aircraft carrier, which allowed fighter pilots and bombers to attack targets that were previously located well outside of their range. This innovation upended the whole concept of naval warfare and has led to much popular and scholarly inquiry. Better known as D-Day, Operation Overlord was a massive Allied amphibious invasion that took place towards the end of World War II. Today, it is counted as one of the most iconic and important military engagements in history. D-Day took place on June 6, 1944, a date that is often regarded as the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany's war against the Western Allies.
Bulletins have been pouring in from Berlin claiming that D-Day is here, claiming that the invasion of Western Europe has begun.
It's undoubtedly true that D-Day played a large part in the Allied victory, which is one of the biggest reasons it is still frequently studied and discussed today. There were no comparable amphibious invasions during World War I either, making D-Day a somewhat unique event in the grander scope of history. And then you've got the scale of it all. More than 150,000 soldiers landed in Normandy on June 6th alone, while thousands of airborne troops parachuted behind enemy lines. Even though the day was not without its costs, the Allied victory on D-Day greatly shortened the length of the war. Notably, June 6th is celebrated and commemorated by both American and European veterans to this day, as the remaining survivors gather at the site of the invasion to pay their respects to those who lost their lives during the invasion. Few battles hold such a sacred place in the collective memory of Western nations. In many ways, World War II was a more dynamic war than World War I. For much of World War I, the Western Front remained almost completely unchanged, with the front line shifting barely more than a few miles, or less, at a time, and never more than 50 miles in either direction. The Eastern Front saw more variable front lines and higher casualties, but even that theater of operations was fought almost entirely on land. But simply, it wasn't particularly complex by military standards. In contrast, World War II featured much more varied fighting on both the Western and Eastern fronts, as well as the combat that took place in the Pacific and Northern Africa, not to mention the expanded air and naval war. The front lines of the Western Front were constantly evolving, especially after the Allied landings at Italy and Normandy, and the Eastern Front also faced various offensives from both sides that saw territory continuously change hands. Often, World War I is remembered better for its senseless slaughters and vast death tolls, while discussions surrounding World War II often skewed towards tactics, technology, and the evolution of warfare. World War II was unquestionably the more fluid and dynamic conflict, and thus it receives more attention from many military historians. If you were to look at Hollywood's portrayal of tanks during World War I, you would come away with a pretty distorted view of their effectiveness. While they are often depicted as revolutionary weapons that helped the Allies win the war, the reality is quite different. It is true that tanks were first used during World War I, but they were hardly the breakthrough weapon they were intended to be. The tanks of World War I were primitive, prone to mechanical failure, had dreadful mobility, and didn't really contribute as much as was hoped on the battlefield. That's definitely not the case for World War II, when tanks played a huge role in the armed forces of both sides. Statistically speaking, only a few thousand tanks were utilized in all of World War I. In World War II, the US made use of 50,000 M4 Sherman tanks alone. So why is this? Well, improvements in technology achieved between the wars turned the tank from a liability into an asset. The production of better, faster, and stronger tanks made the engagements of World War II much more deadly, forever changing the ways in which battles were fought. It's no surprise then that historians have focused so much attention on the use of tanks in the Second World War. Having properly begun in 1933, the Holocaust predates the fighting in Europe by a few years, but it is widely regarded as the most horrific aspect of the Second World War. The Nazis systematically murdered around 6 million Jewish people, as well as millions of Soviets, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, LGBTQ people, and other innocent civilians. The only comparable aspect of World War I would be the Armenian Genocide, which claimed the lives of about 1.5 million Armenians, but it has sadly received relatively little international attention. Much of this has to do with the Turkish government, which refuses to acknowledge official responsibility over the incident even today, and does not participate in commemorations. In contrast, Germany has been entirely transparent regarding the Nazis' responsibility for the atrocities of the Holocaust, and so a number of monuments memorializing its victims have been established throughout Germany, Europe, and the rest of the world. The Holocaust has also been the subject of incredible amounts of research, and it still gets brought up today with sometimes frightening frequency. It's a tragic and unhappy legacy, yes, but an important one nonetheless.